I'll be there. I'm going to get right into it. And so they say, I've heard before, unless somebody is mad, sad, or glad, there wasn't any preaching. So I'm aiming for the glad today. I don't know if the other two will happen, but hopefully if one of those happens, then they'll have been preaching at any rate. So I want to be an encouragement today. You've heard said before, prayer moves the hand of God. I think maybe you've heard that before. I certainly have. And I think about that. And I think to myself, what kind of hand does that move? What kind of hand is the hand of God? The psalmist said in Psalm 89, verse 13, "Thou hast a mighty arm, strong is thy hand, and high is thy right hand." So if prayer moves the hand of God, that's quite a powerful hand. I think you'd agree with me, there is no more powerful hand than that. And all you'd really have to say is, prayer moves the hand of God, and that would be enough to fascinate you, really. That's incredible. So me, a sinner saved by grace, can pray and ask God and move him to do something. That's amazing. It's an amazing thing. When I was in the military service, I stayed with somebody that was in my same platoon, and his name escapes me at the moment, so never mind. You wouldn't have known it anyway. But he was into comic books. He was a comic book person. And so this was back when, I don't know, I was never into that sort of thing. But he liked the comics and the comic books, and he would read them all the time. And he said, what would it be like, this is what he said, if the unstoppable object met the immovable object? Unstoppable force. And he said it like that. He said, the unstoppable force meets the immovable object. I don't know, so I thought, I guess it would reach an energy level beyond which, and he just said there would be the destruction of the universe, and he's thinking about these things, and thinking, I don't know. But then, it was one of those things like, why am I going to waste my time? Who knows? But that really, the Lord is both of those things. Yes. I mean, what if it were to happen? But it doesn't happen because he keeps it in control. That's the hand, and that's so, the Lord doesn't prevent that from happening, thankfully. But here in 2 Chronicles 6, we have Solomon's temple was just built. King Solomon is praying here, and powerful things happen. And so I'm going to look at this, and I want to try to encourage you in your prayer life. And we hear a lot of preaching on prayer, and to be honest with you, normally when somebody preaches on prayer, I'm pretty convicted. I don't know who you are, because you think to yourself, and then somebody mentions something, and I think to myself, okay, I've organized my prayer life. Almost everything that they say, I've got it written down somewhere to make sure I pray for them. They always invent another thing that I'm not praying for. I'm like, oh my word. So you do the best you can. But I want to be an encouragement to you. So these people, let me read verses 1 through 3 of 2 Chronicles 6. And then said Solomon, the Lord hath said that he would dwell in the thick darkness. We'll get to that in a minute. But I've built an house of habitation for thee, and a place for thy dwelling forever. And the king turned his face and blessed the whole congregation of Israel, and all the congregation of Israel stood. Go to verse 12, please. And he stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel, and spread forth his hands. So think about what Solomon's doing, and I want you to put yourself like a person in that congregation. We're going to go back in time and see if we can put ourselves there. For Solomon had made a brazen scaffold of 5 cubits long, so about 7.5 feet, and 5 cubits broad equally, and about 3 cubits high. So was that 4.5 feet high? So I don't know what this is, maybe, I don't know, about that high perhaps, and maybe something like this area right here, and about maybe a little bit lower. So he's in front of everybody, just like I am. And then he set it in the midst of the court. And upon it he stood and kneeled down upon his knees before all the congregation of Israel and spread forth his hands toward heaven. Okay, so think with me. Here's King Solomon. There's a magnificent temple behind him. We know he wasn't in the temple. He wasn't part of the Levitical priesthood. He couldn't go inside the main part of the temple. So he's outside in the court there, and he sets up the scaffolding, and it's a bronze scaffolding. And then he kneels down, and he takes a posture of prayer, doesn't he? He kind of goes like this, and he's looking up into heaven. He's on his knees. Everybody else is looking at him. They're facing him. Go to verse 1. At the end of all of this is what happens. Of chapter 7, verse 1 of chapter 7. Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, The fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. And the priest could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down from heaven and the glory of the Lord upon the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement and worshiped and praised the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. And you can look at chapter 6 and see Solomon's prayer. You'll not see one syllable where he says, Lord, send down fire to consume this. He never says it. He never asked for a cloud. He never asked for the Lord to consume those sacrifices. Never does. And yet the Lord did this. So I got to thinking, well, what is it about this powerful prayer? How does it move the hand of God? I think you'd agree. Solomon was praying here and it moved the hand of God to do something. He consumed these sacrifices. By the way, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of sacrifices. I think it's here in verse 5. Yeah, right there. And King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and the people dedicated the house of God. So 120,000, 22,000. And I think to myself, is that a Fibonacci number? You guys can figure that out later. I don't know. But anyway, he has, like, what's a Fibonacci number? Look that up too. I saw your faces. What? Okay, it's a sequence. Anyway, so we have this fire that comes down. So imagine being there with me. I mean, people came, it says in the scriptures here, all the way from the river of Egypt. So people were there, and this multitude was a great multitude. The people came all the way from there, and so some of them traveled quite a long distance. In fact, they took possibly the same route that the children of Israel did when they left Egypt. I don't know, but it was far, wasn't it? And so what do we have there? You're sitting there, you're facing the king. You've got King Solomon now. This is King Solomon. This is David's son. You know as a Jewish person that this is the lineage that was promised to the nation of Israel in the Davidic covenant. And this man's standing there in front of you, and he's kneeling down, and he's taking a posture of prayer, and he prays this. What else do we have there? So you're in the midst of a bunch of people. I don't know how many people were there. The Bible doesn't tell us. But I don't know if you've ever been in a big crowd of people. I can remember going to the Taste of Chicago years ago. I haven't gone in years. This is before I was saved. And what it was, I don't even know if they still have it, but it was in Grant Park, and the restaurants there would come there, and there was throngs of people there, and just tons of people. And I get really nervous around lots of people, so I don't like to go there. But I can tell you this, there's a lot of energy there. There's just a lot of energy. So if you can imagine being in the midst of all of these multitude of people, and just the energy you would feel there. In addition to that, I would think 120,000 sheep, probably they're making some noise, and bleating and mooing and other animal things. And so there's that going on. You probably hear that. And you probably hear some shuffling and babies cry. Put yourself there. The smells and the sounds and all of that, and your senses and what you're looking at. And maybe you'd be fascinated. Maybe you're really far away because you weren't able to get very close. Maybe you're close. Maybe you're in the middle. I don't know. All these are going on. In addition to that, if they traveled so far, they would have done so by foot. And they would have probably brought a tent. Probably. Normally that's what happened, or stayed in an inn. And so they would have had to, because the Bible also tells us this was for 7 days. So they had to make preparation. They went there, so all the provision they had to have to go there, and then the 7 days to stay there, and then the 7 days to go back. I'm just trying to use my imagination. And so I'm trying to put you there. What would that have been like? What would you have thought? And then on top of that, after, your king prays, it says fire came down from heaven. Now, what in your mind's eye does that look like? I imagine it's just fireball coming down from heaven and consuming all those sacrifices. Wow. Maybe it wasn't all of them. It says it consumed the sacrifice on the brazen altar, and then it says, and those sacrifices. So I'm not sure exactly if it was those or all of them or whatever. It does say the people sacrificed after that time. But I can tell you this, that would have been pretty tremendous. I doubt that you would have forgotten that very easily. And then a cloud filled the temple, the Bible says. So much so that they couldn't do. What happened to them? Their face hit the pavement. I was talking to Mrs. Coslett on Friday. She's on there. She's there, I think, even right now. I told her I was going to talk about her, so I have to do it. So I said, what would that have been like? Just your face on the pavement. Your face, and it's one thing, maybe if you've knelt down before and that kind of thing, but when your face touches the ground, you're down there. And it's an attitude of complete and total subjection. And so they felt something there. They felt the presence of God there, didn't they? It says the glory of the Lord. What does the glory of the Lord when it's present make you want to do? Evidently, these people fell and they couldn't even do their service. Now, clouds have been around before. Their clouds have existed without the glory of the Lord. So has fire. But in this case, it accompanied, I think, what is called in the Bible the glory of the Lord. And Solomon's prayer did this. So Solomon's prayer pleased the Lord. And what he's asking for in chapter 6 is that the Lord use the temple, basically, in a general sense, for whenever the nation of Israel, if they sinned, that they would be forgiven, and that the Lord would use and put his place there at the temple. And so he's dedicating the temple to the Lord. He's basically asking the Lord to accept what they've done. Now, you know, the temple, I think, was a tremendous piece of architecture, certainly for those times. And then you have this massive brazen sea, right, that was there. All of that was there. We're talking about Solomon's temple. So think about that around you. You're standing there probably in the court of women. These things you might be able to see through the little door hole or whatever, doorway. But this is all going on. And we think to ourselves, well, Solomon, what he says, he talks about the thick darkness. Remember I read that before? What does that mean? Solomon reminds himself and the people what the Lord had said. He reminded the people that his father David wanted to make a temple, but there's a condition placed to it. And I'm going to get to this into the conclusion if I can hurry up and get there. That with the blessings of the Lord is conditional. What I mean by that is that there's sometimes a way that the Lord sees that people would respond that could be a problem. We'll get to that. You'll see what I mean. But so what about this thick darkness? In Exodus 20:21, it says, and the people stood afar off, and Moses, you know, the bulls are there, so they're moving. Anyway, I put that together. Drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. So he was there. And this is talking about Mount Sinai. And there's some other references I have here that talk about that. In Hebrews 12:18, it says, for ye are not come into the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest. So Solomon reminded the people, basically, that the Lord had told David through the prophet Samuel, when David had asked that the Lord doesn't need a temple. He doesn't need it. All this time, he had given the prescription for the tabernacle, a simple building, something that could be that is portable. He didn't need this magnificent temple. The Lord allowed David to go through the plans of it and allowed his son Solomon to build it. But it was with that understanding that he didn't need to have it. You remember, and he mentions here too, when the nation of Israel wanted a king. And what did Samuel say? Well, he didn't like that. The Lord was supposed to be their king. And yet they wanted a king. I think it's fascinating too, Deuteronomy 17 and 18 tells the nation of Israel what to do when they had a king. So it wasn't like it was a surprise. He said you weren't supposed to multiply wives and you weren't supposed to multiply horses. Let me remind you, Solomon did both. And so just because he had this magnificent temple doesn't mean that you're necessarily right with God or that God's going to bless you. So I think there's something about this. And so Solomon reminded the people what the Lord had told the prophet Samuel and David's desire in these things. So let's look at this prayer and see what we can gain from it. So I'm going to read chapter 7. Okay, so the first thing I see is that powerful prayer gains divine acceptance. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. Okay, so clearly we can see here that we have the Lord accepting these sacrifices. Okay, so the Lord is showing Solomon through his prayer, I accept your prayer. And I'm going to accept these sacrifices as well. It's funny, this in 1 Kings 8, the exact same thing is recorded for us, but nothing you'll find in 1 Kings 8 about fire coming down from heaven. Nothing is there. You would think of a miraculous event, but it's not there. It's recorded for us here only. And so the Lord here accepts it. He didn't accept it perhaps in the way that Solomon was expecting, but he certainly showed that he accepted it. So here's the thing. With this fire, the first time fire is used in different ways. I think you understand this. That fire, the first time we see fire was when the Sodom and Gomorrah was consumed, and that fire came down from heaven. But in the case of judgment, there wasn't it. Sometimes the Bible is seen as a fire, and in fact, God Himself is a consuming fire. The Bible says so. Fire is used in different ways in the Bible. But I think the history of Cain shows us that just because somebody sacrifices doesn't mean that it's accepted, is it? Not necessarily. But I think the Lord showed here. So how does this relate to you? How does it relate to me? Well, I think that certainly prayer is a sacrifice, isn't it? It is. I'm not saying it's a huge sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice in the sense that you're sacrificing your time and your energy and your thoughts, and you're taking the time to pray. It is a sacrifice. So let me ask you this. How do you know that the Lord accepts it? If you prayed and fire came down from heaven, I think you could say that he probably accepted it. That would be one thing. But can we know that? Can we know that the Lord accepts us after we pray? Do we pray? Let me ask you this. Do you pray and ask the Lord to accept the sacrifices that you make? Maybe you can pray and say, Lord, show me that you've heard me. Have you ever prayed that prayer? I'm telling you, if you do that, he will. Now, I'm not saying fire will come down from heaven. Let me give you an example. I asked this for the Lord, and sometimes he'll answer it in different ways. And yesterday morning, I woke up, and I just needed something from the Lord, and he put a song in my heart that is exactly what I needed. And with that, he was saying, I heard you. Sometimes it's that. But you say to yourself, because otherwise we pray all these things, and what's the point? If we don't know the Lord hears us. And if the Lord here was willing to send down fire from heaven to show that he heard and accepted what Solomon's prayer was, then couldn't we do the same thing? Try it. God will show you. Ask him. Ask him to show you that he's accepted it. It will be an encouragement to you. So, prayer is powerful because it gains divine acceptance. Number two, we see in the second part of this verse, verse 1, now when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and sacrifice, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. So, it is true that you have fire, and that was a manifestation from the Lord, but there's this glory of the Lord that was also there in addition. Certainly the fire and the cloud were symbolic of that, but the glory of the Lord is there. And I said before, you could have fire without the presence of God, and you could have a cloud without the presence of God, but here it accompanied it. And though sometimes it is shown this way in these supernatural events, the New Testament, you might be, so I thought to myself, okay, the glory of the Lord, that's God's presence, certainly. His glory was there. He somehow showed himself apart from the fire and cloud there. They knew that. That's what caused them to go down to the pavement. That was the thing that caused them to lay prostrate. So I thought to myself, well, how is that in the New Testament? Is the glory of the Lord used in the New Testament, that phrase? You might be surprised. I thought there'd be tons and tons of times. There's only two. Only 2 times ever that it's used in the New Testament. The first time is this one. Luke 2:9 says, and lo, the angel of the Lord came to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. You might recognize this as the shepherds that were listening to the angelic messengers that told about the birth of Christ. So that's the glory of the Lord. So what accompanied the glory of the Lord there? This multitude of angelic hosts. It accompanied it. And then in 2 Corinthians 3:18 says this, but we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. So both of these instances in the New Testament seem to talk about the presence of the Lord. One is through the proclamation of the birth of Christ, and then the other one is the presence of the Lord through the person of the God's Spirit. So both instances talk about Christ and his presence being there, one physically and then one through the Spirit. I can remember being in college here years ago, and in college here we're talking about late 90s, early, at the same time. Many of us were in college together. And I was with a lot of your mom and dads there in college together. And at that time, I had just been saved. Now, my situation, I think, was somewhat unique because I was saved, and then I think 4 or 5 months later, I was in Bible college, just that quick. And I was in Bible college here, and I had no idea. I didn't know what John 3:16. I'll be honest with you, I could not quote John 3:16 when I went to the dorm. I couldn't have told you what the books of the Bible were. That's how ignorant I was. But I was here in college. And so I'm here with all these, like you guys are, pastors, kids, missionaries, kids. Well, they've been taught this from them. I felt so inferior. I didn't know anything. And I came here, and I don't know if it was that or what it was. And I don't know if you can relate to this. I think so. That you're just in a fog, I guess is the best way to say it. You know that the Lord is there, but you just can't see him. Maybe you know what I mean. And I can remember asking the Lord, help me. I didn't even know what I was feeling. I didn't know that. And this was the first time, since I had gotten saved, and until that time, it was real simple. The Lord said, do this, do this. It was very easy. And that was the first time where I just thought that's the Christian life. You get this clear direction all the time. But there came that time where I just didn't have what I needed. And the Lord answered that prayer through another song, interestingly. It was that song that says, it's just like Jesus to roll the clouds away. I sang that, the chapel used to, not here, it used to be in the auditorium. And we sang that song, and the Lord was saying, that's it. What He was teaching me is that I needed His presence. I needed Him to be there, present. And so this glory of the Lord is the presence of the Lord. And this was a tremendous, to me, revelation to me, because I was learning things. Again, I was very ignorant of things. But I think the Lord was showing me that I needed to know and have His presence. When my family and I were on deputation for a short time, I could not see I don't know what the phrase is, but you know the Lord is there, is what I'm saying, but you can't detect Him. You need Him to show Himself. And I was like that because we were, things had happened and we had to leave the church we were at, and the Lord was directing all of them. We didn't know where to go, so we ended up going to New York because my father-in-law was there. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't have a house. I sold everything. So we went there, and it was a very difficult time because we kind of got there, and I'm thinking, all right, Lord, now what? Do I keep going here or not? The Lord made it very clear that I needed to be there for an extended amount of time. So I had to call these pastors again and let them know to cancel all those meetings that I had set up. And that was a tough time for me. I thought I had let the Lord down. I thought I disappointed Him. And I needed to see Him. So I went to I got in a tent, and I went to a campsite for 3 days. And I mean like 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights. And the Lord had me there, and my purpose there was to find out what my next step was. And I fasted the whole time. I didn't want to eat. It's not like I made myself to do it. I just didn't want to. I just needed to see Him so much. Here I had my family. I had to lead, and I didn't know where to go. You can imagine putting yourself in that situation. And I needed to see the Lord, and I needed His presence in a real way, and I was going to stay there till I had it. And you might say to yourself, maybe it would have been nice for the Lord to show Himself to you right away, but He didn't. He let me stay there for 3 days. And what did I do? I think I read from Genesis to Isaiah. I think it was. I don't remember. In some of the New Testament, I just read and read and read and read and read and read and prayed and read and prayed and read and prayed. And I don't think that I've ever offered myself as open and freely to Him as I did then. I mean, I was completely and totally His. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do, nothing. And there were times in that time where I just laid there in the tent, just laid there. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't say anything, just laid there. And the lots and lots of emotion, lots of these things. And walking. I can remember walking for miles one way, just praying and walking the other way and trying to find out. And it was a bit of a battle, quite frankly. And at the end of it all, this is what the Lord said. I'm thinking of this tremendous revelation. 2 words. Go home. That's all He said. Go home. And so I'm thinking to myself, I don't have a home. Where would I go? And He meant go back with your family. Okay, and I had peace. I had peace about it, and I was hungry again. So I knew that it was over. And so I went home and ate, and my wife went, okay, what do we need to do? I don't know. What did the Lord say to do? He's just said to go home. Okay, so that's what we did. And you say, well, it was 2 more years before the Lord ever showed it. And so I just plodded along. What did I do in those 2 years? Lots of things. I had to work. We couldn't just sit there forever. I didn't know how long I was going to be there. So I found a job and I worked. And then there came a time where, and it was a really, really hard time to find work at that time. Nobody was hiring. I ended up finding a job, and I was there for I don't know how many months. And then I went to, and then I lost that job. And then I went to my father and I said, okay, Lord, I don't know what to do, but you want me to serve you, so I went to my father-in-law and said, anything you want me to do, I'm here. it's not any kind of position to be paid. I'm just going to do whatever you want me to do, anything. All day long, I'm going to work at the church, do whatever you want me to do, and that's what I did. Eventually, I became the principal of the school, and then after 2 years, the Lord directed me here. But he left me there all that time, and that's what I needed. And I needed to see his presence, and I needed to know that he was there with me. If you want that, ask for it. Sometimes you'll need it. Sometimes you'll need that. Sometimes you'll be kind of hanging out there, and you need to have his presence. You've got to have it. It's not something that's nice to have. Okay, Lord, please be with us. You know, you hear prayers like that. But when you're in a situation like that, it's not like, oh, Lord, please be. It's more like, you know, you're begging, Lord, please, I don't know what to do here. And the Lord has us there on purpose, and I learned a lot. So prayer is powerful because it elicits the presence of the Lord. Number 3, look at verse 2 in chapter 7. And the priest could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. They could not enter in. Why were these priests there? What was their purpose? Their purpose was to fulfill the Levitical law and to be a priest. Their purpose was to offer these sacrifices, wasn't it? But all of a sudden, they couldn't do that anymore. Because all of a sudden, it wasn't about what they could do. It was about what the Lord was doing among them. And so the Lord was taking control here. I would ask you, do you have a strong anticipation for the Lord to do great things? Ask him. Ask him. He will. Maybe not in the way that you think. He will. He may tell you, I'd like to do great things, but you got to change this and that. And that's probably the state of most of us. But he will. I remember I wanted the Lord to do things, great things, in my family. And I'm the first generation in my family, Christian. And so when you're that way, I don't know if any of you have that experience, but maybe some are that way. But when you're that way, you understand what the Lord has done for you, and you take your, you look at your family, and you say to yourself, Lord, I shouldn't. Why should I be saved and they're not? You can't figure it out, and you try to, and you tell yourself, well, okay, Lord, if you save me, you can save them. And so I had this very, very strong will for the Lord to save. So I called them, and it didn't go well. Okay, I was in Tennessee at the time, and I remember talking to my brother, and he's cursing. It was my younger brother. He's never been that way with me before. He's cursing, unbelievable. My dad, I'm not going to go into it. It was not good. And so I'm talking about this, and their attitude was, you think you're holier than thou. You think you know more than we do. And it's cursing, and it was terrible. And I thought, well, you know, Lord, they're not going to listen to me. And I can remember being in Tennessee and praying this prayer. Lord, I can't do anything for them. They're not letting me do anything for them. So I just prayed this. Lord, send somebody over there that will talk to them. Well, it wasn't long after that, and this is a pretty amazing thing, that I got in touch with my dad, and he said, yeah, one of your church people came over. And I had been in Tennessee for years. I'm thinking, what? And he said, yeah, this guy came by. He knows you. He knows me. He goes, yeah, his name's Dave Johnson. I go, Dave Johnson went to my dad's house to appraise his house. Heard his last name. Somehow they understood this was my dad, and he witnessed to my dad. Couldn't believe it. I should have believed it, but I didn't. I believed, you know what I mean? And then I thought, well, Lord, send somebody to my mom, my stepmother. And by the way, my stepmother's in heaven now. And I said, and this is how he did that. I got to hurry here. I knew I was going to get through this. It was all because of Molly. Molly is a dog. I don't like dogs, but I like this dog. Molly was the neighbor's dog. What I mean by that, he lived in Maryville, and across the street, Molly was their dog. Molly preferred to stay with my dad than to go over there. So without saying anything to them, the dog just stayed there at their house. He didn't say anything to them. So I'm candy selling in Chicago with some people from the school. And I get this phone call. And it's my stepmother. Now, at this point, my dad had passed away. And so she, for a time, stayed by herself. well, Molly was there, but she was by herself. And that's the whole point. And the neighbors across the way, whose dog she was, were Christians. In fact, they go to First Baptist in Hammond. So I get a call. So my mom says, yeah, I got a visit for them. Well, then this lady, their neighbor, calls me. So I thought, what in the world is going on? Well, it turns out that this woman had been bitter against my parents because they stole her dog. I mean, it was real bitterness. They were having problems spiritually. And then she found out that my dad had passed away. And the Lord revealed to her why the dog was there. And it was to accompany my stepmother so that she wouldn't be alone. She understood that there was a function to it, and that her bitterness was all wrong about that. And so the Lord led her to walk across the street and to witness to my stepmother. She witnesses to her. I had already seen my stepmother saved. So she says, yeah, my son witnessed to me, and so I did that, and I'm a saved person. She said, oh, but my brother was on the police department at St. John. He was a policeman in Lowell and then in St. John for 20 years together. And I was praying for his salvation. And so this woman, I think it's her son or her nephew, was a police officer in the same department. Turns out, I talked to my brother years later, this person led my brother to the Lord. It's like, you can't make that stuff up. So I prayed that the Lord would take control, and he did. Then, so it anticipates divine control, and then, I don't have any time, but they're humble, right? So I'll just give you these. It establishes divine position. We are humbled, and he's prayed. I mean, he's praised, pardon me. So the glory of the Lord was there, and they were on their face on the pavement. So true prayer, true powerful prayer, makes your position with God very clear. It makes how low you really are, because we don't see that. But when you really pray powerfully, that's evident to you, how great he is. And then lastly, it encourages divine service. So at this point, then they were willing to sacrifice. I refer you to Hannah. You remember she prayed earnestly in the temple there. The Lord would give her, I think she said a man-child, but a son. And the Lord did that. And she said this, that was a powerful prayer because it led her to sacrifice him, not physically, but, to the temple. And she promised to do that. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. I've never been a mom, but I would think, you carry 9 months and now you're going to give him up. That wasn't easy, but she did it. And it was powerful prayer because that prayer was powerful enough, and it leads you to sacrifice more. That's what prayer does. This is what powerful prayer does. If we go on here in 2 Chronicles 7, let me just bring this out, and I got to finish. It was tempered with a warning. So the king and all the people offered sacrifice, remember verse 4. And King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep and so forth. And the priests waited on their offices, and the Levites with the instruments of music. Moreover, Solomon hallowed the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And he kept the feast 7 days. It was a very great congregation. Verse 9, and the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. And on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away. And thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all that came into Solomon's heart to make in the house of the Lord and in his own house, he prosperously effected. And the Lord appeared to Solomon, here it is, by night, and said unto him, I have heard thy prayer, and have chosen this place to myself for an house of sacrifice. If I shut up heaven, that there be no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, and if I send pestilence among thy people, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land. This is kind of the main, iconic verse on revival, isn't it? But it was born out of the Lord giving a condition to Solomon. Basically, he's telling him this, you've built this temple, that's great. But your people, even though there's this wonderful temple there, your people are not going to always obey me, and there's going to be problems. And so the Lord doesn't want them to think just because this temple is there and that the Lord accepted this temple and did all of these things, that they have this unconditional openness to do whatever they want to do. I wonder then how many prayers the Lord, although the Lord wants to bless us, but he can't, because he knows the pride of our heart, that if he were to answer those prayers, we would be prideful about it. Do you remember when the Lord gave the disciples power over devils and to go out and to give the gospel message? And what did they come back? What did they say? Lord, these devils were subject to what we say. And what does the Lord say there? Don't be excited about that, but rather that your names are written in heaven. So sometimes we're so depraved in our heart and in our nature and in our pride that I don't think the Lord can bless us the way he wants to. So this is given with a charge, isn't it? I think powerful prayer is available to all of us. It gains divine acceptance. Ask the Lord to show you. It gains divine manifestation. You want the presence of the Lord in this sacrifice of prayer. It anticipates divine control. That distance between you and God are going to be more evident to you. It shows the divine position will be humbled, and then it encourages divine service. So I guess, I don't know what you would receive out of this, but I hope the Lord will bless you and help you understand what real powerful prayer is all about. Let's pray.